This concerns the Wasteland, the poem The Wasteland. A while ago I did some writing about collaboration in the production of a work of art, something I hadn't given much thought before, believing it to be, in its essence, of a more independent nature. And it must have been drifting around in my brain because I was suddenly reminded out of nowhere of one of the most famous works of collaboration in the last century, and one of the last century's most famous poems, The Wasteland, by T S Eliot. The Wasteland was published late in 1922 in 3 periodicals and as a book. In 1923 it was also published as a separate volume by the Hogarth Press. In January of 1922, Eliot arrived in Paris with a poem he'd been working on all over Europe, winding up in a sanitarium where he was treated for mental instability. Eliot had previously published poetry, including most notably the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but he'd never written anything of this magnitude. It was, he said, the manuscript of a sprawling, chaotic poem. It had rather gotten away from him. He could use some help. He gave it to Ezra Pound, who thought it was a masterpiece, but it clearly needed work. He was eager to help. He began annotating the typewritten pages. Those manuscripts have survived, and we can see exactly what contributions Pound made to the final finished work. Pound called himself a male midwife, performing a cesarean section in order to deliver the baby. Eliot would later dedicate the poem to him, calling him Il Miglior Fabbro, the better craftsman. Pound called Eliot Old Possum. Eliot distinguished between the original creative impulse, which came unbidden from the muses, and the final shaping of the work, which he called critical labor, this frightful toil, the labor of sifting, combining, constructing, expunging, correcting, testing. It was the critical labor that Pound was supplying. Eliot wrote, he tried first to understand what one was attempting to do, and then tried to help one do it in one's own way. A very delicate psychological operation, I would say. In editing the work, Pound was after style and freshness above all else. And they could thread music through it by the use of recurrent themes. As for editorial comments on the page, Pound's most famous one here was echt in German, for the real thing. Other than that, he used okay and stet. For corrections, he wrote too tum-pum, too penty, too loose, and too easy. Originally, the title of the poem was He Do the Police in Different Voices, a line Eliot cribbed from Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. Eliot, I think, was fabulously well read. The poem is filled with references to other works, other cultures, other times, and other languages. That is strange to me because Pound was fiercely opposed to writing that had to be explicated in schools and could not be read and understood in the street. The first line of the poem was, first we had a couple of feelers down at Tom's place. The poem became The Wasteland. Pound cut the first 54 lines, and the opening became, April is the cruelest month, breeding. That takes me immediately to the Canterbury Tales, tells me that the world has changed radically, and makes me think that this may be some sort of another pilgrimage. Pound cut 72 lines of social satire out of the fire sermon section, and 83 lines from Death by Water. We lost a defecation, a urination, some anti-Semitism, and misogyny. When Eliot sent him his revised manuscript, Pound responded, Complimenti, you bitch. I am racked by the 7 jealousies. The poem stands as a monument to modern poetry, like Cubist painting. Readers are presented with pieces and are forced to interpret for themselves. I went back and read it and understood almost nothing it had to say, at some considerable length. It was difficult to continue reading since I was so lost. My ignorance and unfeeling were not mitigated in the least by the learned notes that followed. This is yet another instance of a high point in Western culture that went sailing right over my head. But it was of some interest to witness and even feel the collaboration between the male midwife and the old possum. That did give the piece a bit of life for me. I suspect it has provided entire careers for many college professors.